My name is Eleanor Hayes, and I am 71 years old as I sit here telling you this story. I live in Memphis, Tennessee, in a small house near the river, and I want to tell you about the time I lost everything and found out that losing everything is sometimes the best thing that can happen to you. This is a story about betrayal, yes, but more than that. It's a story about what happens when you decide that life doesn't get to diminish you anymore. If you're listening to this story right now, drop a comment below and tell me where you are listening this from. This would help us build a strong community of story lovers. For 34 years, I was married to a good man. His name was Robert Hayes, and he was a banker. Careful with numbers, careful with his affections, careful with his promises. He was the kind of man who always knew exactly how much money was in the account and exactly how much respect he'd earned in his community. We met at a church social in 1958 when I was 23 years old and still believed that life was a linear path you could plan if you were careful enough. I was working as a secretary at a law firm. Robert was already established in his career, already moving up the ladder at First Tennessee Bank. He was 10 years older than me, which felt significant at the time. It felt like maturity, like security, like someone who knew how the world worked. He wore expensive watches and drove a car that other people admired. He knew which fork to use at fancy dinners and how to talk to important people. He asked me out 4 times before I said yes. I said no the first 3 times because I was afraid. He was intimidating in his certainty, in the way he moved through the world like he owned it. But the 4th time, on a warm evening in May, he came to pick me up with flowers and a smile that actually reached his eyes, and I decided that maybe being afraid was the point. Maybe you were supposed to be afraid of the people who changed your life. We dated for 2 years. He was patient with me in the way men of that era understood patience. He didn't push me physically. He treated me with a kind of formal respect that I interpreted as love. He introduced me to his family, a respectable Memphis family with old money and older expectations. His mother, Judith, looked at me the way you might look at a piece of furniture you were considering purchasing. With assessment, with calculation, wondering if I would fit the aesthetic of the life she'd imagined for her son. "She's pretty enough," she said to Robert once when she thought I wasn't listening. "And she seems docile. That's good." Those words should have been a warning, but I was young and I interpreted being docile as being kind, being accommodating, being a good wife. I thought it meant I would be loved if I didn't ask for too much, if I didn't take up too much space, if I arranged myself around Robert's life like a piece of his success. We married in a large church wedding in June of 1960. I wore my mother's dress, altered to fit me, because we couldn't afford a new one. Robert wore a suit that cost more than my entire wedding outfit. My father, who worked as a mechanic, sat in the front pew looking uncomfortable in a borrowed tuxedo. Robert's father didn't come. He was ill, but his mother sat ramrod straight, making sure everyone knew she was the family now, that I was joining something important. The reception was at the country club. Robert's mother had orchestrated everything. My mother had wanted to do some of the planning, but Judith made it clear that this was a family affair, and my family, while nice enough, simply didn't have the resources or the connections to handle something of this caliber. So my mother sat in the background, and I got married in a celebration that was really about Robert and his family, with me as the beautiful prop at the center of it. David was born in 1962. He came into the world on a hot July night after 18 hours of labor, and when I held him for the first time, I understood something I'd never understood before about love. It wasn't the polite, controlled affection that Robert offered me. It was visceral. It was animal. It was a love so large it frightened me. Robert was less certain about fatherhood. He loved David, I think, but from a distance. He paid for the best schools. He made sure David had the things a boy needed. A bicycle, a baseball glove, later a nice car for his 16th birthday. But he didn't know how to play with him. He didn't understand the grammar of childhood, the way you had to get down on the floor and be silly, the way you had to listen to long, meandering stories about insects and imaginary kingdoms. So David became mine, in the way children do when one parent is absent and the other is everything. I was the one he came to when he was scared. I was the one who knew exactly how to make his favorite sandwiches, who remembered which teacher had criticized him in 3rd grade and made sure to reach out to that teacher, who stayed up through the night when he was sick with fever. Robert's job consumed him. He worked long hours at the bank. He had golf games on Saturday mornings. He had business dinners where his presence was required and my presence was ornamental. He brought home money, and I was grateful for it. We lived in a beautiful house in East Memphis, a neighborhood of tree-lined streets and substantial homes. We had help, a woman named Maria who came twice a week to clean and iron, a man named Thomas who took care of the yard. I belonged to clubs and committees. I was, by every standard of my time and place, a successful woman, but I was also a ghost in my own life. Looking back now, I can see the ways I was already disappearing, years before Victoria ever entered the picture. I was 25, then 30, then 35, and with each year that passed, I became more and more efficient at the art of making myself invisible. I learned to want what Robert wanted. I learned to smile at his jokes, even the ones that weren't funny. I learned to dress in ways that he approved of. Nothing too flashy, nothing too sexy, nothing that might make him feel threatened or that might draw other men's attention. I learned to manage the household in ways that required no input from him. The bills were paid. The house was immaculate. David was thriving. Everything ran smoothly, which was the point. Robert had paid for a smooth life, and smooth is what he wanted. I had friends, women I met through the church and the clubs, women who were living versions of the same life I was living. We would have lunch together and complain gently about our husbands, and we would laugh at the shared comedy of men who didn't understand why we needed to have our hair done, why we needed to have lunch together, what we talked about during those long afternoons in restaurants. I volunteered at the library. I volunteered at the church. I read books and lived vicarious lives through novels. Women who had adventures, who made choices, who weren't simply managing the life that someone else had designed for them. But I never said any of this to Robert. I had a good life. I had a son I loved desperately. I had security, and I had learned somewhere along the way that wanting more than what you had was ungrateful, was selfish, was a betrayal of the man who was providing all of this. So I stayed quiet, and I became very, very good at making myself small. Robert died on a Thursday afternoon in early March. He was at work, at a meeting with some important clients, when his heart simply stopped. Just stopped. Like a machine that had finally given up on the job it had been designed to do. He was 58 years old. He was supposed to have years left. He was supposed to retire at 65, travel with me, maybe spend time actually knowing his grandchildren when David eventually had them. There was supposed to be time. There was always supposed to be time. The bank called me, a woman's voice, professional and kind, telling me that there had been an incident, that Robert had collapsed, that an ambulance had been called. By the time I got to the hospital, he was already gone. The doctors used careful language. Massive myocardial infarction, no warning signs, very sudden, very peaceful. As if peaceful made any difference. As if the way he died was supposed to matter when he was still dead. David was 27. He was living in his own apartment, working in his first real job out of college. He came to the hospital and he held me while I didn't cry. I wasn't a crier even then. I had spent my whole life not being a crier, holding things inside where they couldn't bother anyone else. The funeral was large. Robert's bank sent flowers. His colleagues came. His mother, Judith, took control of the arrangements the way she had taken control of my wedding, making sure everything reflected well on the family. I was a widow now. I had a role to play. I had to be the grieving wife, the stoic woman who stood by her son, the picture of controlled sadness. What no one told me was what came after. What no one warned me about was how quickly the life you've spent 34 years building can collapse, and how little you're left with when it does. I moved in with David 6 months after Robert died. It seemed like the logical thing to do. I had money, Robert's insurance payout, his savings, my own pension. I could have lived independently, but I was 53 years old, and I had spent my entire adult life being organized around other people. The thought of living alone terrified me more than I wanted to admit. David was living in a beautiful apartment in a trendy neighborhood. He'd been promoted at work. He'd married Victoria, who worked in something called corporate development at a design firm. She was brilliant and beautiful, and the kind of woman who made you feel like you were always slightly behind on understanding how the world actually worked. When I moved in, she was gracious about it. She helped me decorate a bedroom that would be mine, a space that was tastefully done but clearly temporary. "Just until you get your feet under you," she said, with a smile that was warm on the surface and cold underneath. The first incident happened about 3 weeks into my stay. I had made a soufflé, a chocolate one, Robert's favorite, which I'd been making for 30 years. I thought it would be nice to make something special for David's company one evening. I made it because I didn't know what else to do with myself. I didn't know how to be useful in David's house in any other way. Victoria came home from work and found me in the kitchen. She didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at the soufflé cooling on the counter, and then she looked at me. "You made a soufflé," she said, her tone suggesting I had done something slightly absurd. "Yes. Eleanor, we were planning to eat at the new restaurant downtown." "I didn't get a text," I said, which was true. I had checked my phone multiple times. There was no text. She pulled out her phone and showed me. David had texted her, not me. He'd asked her what she wanted to do for dinner, mentioned the restaurant, and she had apparently agreed. That was the text he'd sent about dinner. "Oh, I see." "It's fine," she said, but her body had gone rigid. We didn't take the soufflé. We went to dinner and the soufflé sat in the kitchen, slowly collapsing the way soufflés do. When we came home, late and drunk on wine and the feeling of a successful evening that I had not been invited to properly participate in, Victoria looked at it with disgust. "You know, Eleanor, when you cook something and no one eats it, it kind of feels like you're wasting food." "David told you." It was the first time she lied to me outright, and I knew she was lying. But I was 60 years older than her and somehow made to feel like I was being unreasonable. I threw the soufflé away and I didn't cook again for a week. That was the beginning. The years I spent living with David and Victoria were years during which I learned to disappear. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in small increments, until one day I looked in the mirror and could barely recognize who was looking back. Victoria was never outright cruel, not in the beginning. That was what made it so effective. She was simply better at everything than I was. She was more sophisticated. She had better taste. She understood what was important in life and what was trivial. And I was, by comparison, a relic from an earlier era, someone who still did things the old way, who still believed in things that didn't matter anymore. She would make comments about my appearance, always wrapped in false concern. "That dress is so sweet, Eleanor." Translation: "You look like an old woman from another decade. Are you sure about that color?" Translation: "You look ridiculous." She would interrupt me when I was talking, not rudely, just casually, like what I was saying wasn't important enough to wait for. If I was telling a story, she would cut me off with a question for David about his day, and the story would simply stop. After a while, I stopped telling stories. She would schedule things for the two of them and forget to mention it to me. Dinners with friends, weekend trips, plans that happened in the house I was living in. I would find out when I came downstairs at 6 o'clock on a Saturday night, ready to suggest we all have dinner together, only to discover they'd already left hours before and wouldn't be back until late. She created a world in which I didn't quite fit, in which my presence was more of a problem than a comfort. And David, who should have been my ally, my child, the person who had grown up hearing me say, "Your feelings matter, and you should stand up for what you believe in." David simply didn't seem to notice any of this was happening, or maybe he noticed but didn't care. That was the cruelest possibility, and I tried not to think about it too much. Instead, I made myself useful. I cooked elaborate dinners that Victoria would describe as sweet, but a little much for their modern palate. I cleaned things that Maria had already cleaned. I did laundry and folded clothes. I rearranged the kitchen cabinets according to Victoria's specifications. I made myself into a servant in my son's house, and he watched it happen and didn't stop it. The worst part was that I was beginning to believe the narrative that Victoria was constructing. I was beginning to think that maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too old. Maybe my presence was inconvenient. Maybe I should be grateful that they were allowing me to stay, that David was providing for me, that Victoria hadn't forced me out already. It came in the middle of a renovation project. David and Victoria had decided that the house needed to be updated. Every room modernized, every outdated element stripped away and replaced with something clean and contemporary. The work went on for months, workers coming and going, dust settling on every surface, the constant sound of drills and hammers, and the beeping of things being moved. I had been living in David's childhood bedroom, a small, simple space that held a narrow bed and a dresser, and the weight of all his childhood memories. It was the most comfortable place in the house for me, actually, because it still smelled like him, still had the faint impression of who he'd been before he became whoever he was now. One morning, Victoria came upstairs and announced that they'd decided to expand the master bedroom suite. They were going to demolish David's childhood room to create a larger walk-in closet. The closet, she said with that particular smile, was very important to her. She needed the space. I had about a week to move. There was nowhere else to go in the house. The guest room was being gutted. The basement was too damp. They offered me a bedroom in the back near the kitchen, a storage room that was being converted. But it wasn't ready yet, they explained. It would take a few more weeks. In the meantime, where would I go? Well, Victoria said thoughtfully, you have savings, don't you? From Robert and your pension? Maybe it's time you got your own place, something small. She said it like she was doing me a favor, like she'd finally figured out the solution to the problem I presented. I didn't argue, I didn't cry, I didn't do any of the things that might have made David actually pay attention to what was happening. Instead, I started packing my things into boxes. My life, reduced to what could fit in garbage bags and plastic bins. David came home one evening and found me doing this. He stopped in the doorway of his childhood bedroom, and I waited for him to say something. I waited for him to understand what was happening, to put together the pieces, to realize that his mother was being asked to leave because her presence had become too inconvenient. Mom, he said carefully, we talked about this. Victoria thinks it's better if you got your own place. I have independence, I said quietly. I have more independence than I've ever had. He flinched. That's not fair. I do love you, but Victoria is my wife. I know, I said, and I did. That was the thing that hurt the most. I knew. I had always known. Children grow up and leave, and the people they build their lives with become more important. That's how it's supposed to work. But I hadn't expected him to do it with so little grace, with so little acknowledgement of what he was asking me to give up. We'll help you get settled, he said, trying to make it sound like an adventure, like this was something I'd wanted all along. I finished packing. I found an apartment in a part of Memphis that was aging and tired and affordable. It was 1 bedroom, 1 bath, with windows that faced the street. The walls were thin. I could hear my neighbors' fights, their laughter, the sounds of their lives. It was the loneliest place I'd ever lived, and it was mine. I was 58 years old, and I was starting over. The first month in the apartment was the worst. I would wake up in the mornings not knowing what I was supposed to do with my day. For 34 years, Robert's schedule had determined mine. For 5 years, I'd been organizing my days around trying to be invisible in David's house. Now, suddenly, I had nothing but time and the echoing emptiness of a space that was mine, but felt like it belonged to no one. I would lie in bed listening to the sounds of other people's lives happening around me. Upstairs, a couple would fight about money. Next door, someone would play music at odd hours. The sounds of these lives should have been comforting. Proof that I wasn't completely alone. Instead, they made me feel more isolated, more aware that I was separate from all of it, that I was 70 years old and starting from nothing. David called occasionally. He was careful on the phone, aware, I think, that he'd wronged me in some way that he wasn't quite able to articulate. He offered to help with rent, but I refused. I didn't want his money. If I took his money, it meant I was still dependent on him, still his responsibility, still someone he had to manage. Instead, I lived frugally on my pension, which I'd saved carefully for just such a circumstance, though I'd never really believed such a circumstance would arrive. Victoria, when David brought her to the phone, was cheerful. "We miss you, Eleanor." I never went to dinner. The thought of sitting in that house, watching her arrange the evening for maximum comfort and elegance, knowing that she'd engineered my removal from it, it was too much. Instead, I sat in my apartment and tried to remember who I was beyond the roles that had defined me. I was not Robert's wife anymore. I was barely David's mother. I was 60 years old with 50 years potentially ahead of me, and I had no idea what to do with them. The building I lived in was full of women like me. That's what I realized slowly as I became aware of the rhythms of the place. There was Mrs. Chen on the second floor, a tiny woman in her 80s who'd come to Memphis from Shanghai in 1965 to marry a man she met through a matchmaker. He'd been kind enough, she said, but her daughter, the only child they'd had married a man who didn't approve of extended family. The daughter rarely visited. Mrs. Chen had been living in this apartment for 12 years, ever since her husband died. There was Miss Dorothy on the third floor, who'd been 73 when I moved in. Her family had essentially abandoned her decades before, when she'd made the mistake of falling in love with a woman in an era when that kind of love wasn't supposed to exist. She'd lost everything: her family, her home, the life she might have had. She'd spent 50 years building a small, isolated existence, letting people hurt her because at least when people were hurting you, you knew they were paying attention. There was Ms. Garcia in 3B, a woman from Puerto Rico who'd had 6 children, all of whom had moved to New York or California or Texas, chasing their own lives. They called on holidays, they sent money sometimes, but they didn't come home. And she'd raised them alone after her husband left, worked double shifts for decades, and now lived on what she could afford on a secretary's pension. There was Miss Roberta, who'd never married, who'd taught music at the high school for 40 years, who'd put her sister's children through college, only to have that sister's daughter tell her at a reunion that she didn't understand why Miss Roberta had never accomplished anything real, never had a family of her own. And there was Mrs. Jackson, a woman who'd been married for 51 years to a man who left her for his secretary the day after their retirement party. He'd taken most of the money, and she'd been left with just enough to afford a place like this. All of us in this building were invisible women. Women who'd given too much. Women who'd been used up and discarded. Women who had nowhere else to go. At first, I didn't realize this was what I was. I saw these women and felt a clinical sympathy for them. The kind of sympathy you have for people whose lives have gone wrong. It took me weeks to realize that my life had gone just as wrong, that I was one of them now. The thing that saved me was something so small that I almost dismissed it as trivial. I made bread. I'd made bread for 40 years. Simple bread, complex bread, bread with seeds and herbs and sourdough cultures that had been passed down through generations of my family. It was something I did as automatically as breathing, something that required no thought, that my hands knew how to do, even when my mind was elsewhere. One Saturday, about a month into living in the apartment, I was overwhelmed by the silence. I couldn't bear to sit with my thoughts anymore, so I got up, pulled out my ancient mixer, which I'd rescued from David's house, one of the few things they hadn't replaced with something newer and better, and I made a loaf of sourdough. The smell filled the apartment. It seeped under the doors and into the hallway. My neighbor upstairs came down and knocked on my door. Miss Dorothy asked. She was using a cane, and her face was lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from living alone and having no reason to get out of bed. I made bread, I said, suddenly self-conscious. So I gave her a loaf, warm and crusty and still slightly steaming from the oven. She came in and we sat at my tiny kitchen table, and she ate a slice while it was still hot, with nothing on it but her own tears. I haven't eaten anything that wasn't from a can or a box in so long, she said. The next week I made bread again. This time I left loaves on the doorsteps of 3 apartments, Mrs. Chen's, Miss Roberta's, Ms. Garcia's. I left them anonymously at first, just cooling loaves with no note. But they knew, of course they knew, there was only one person in the building who would do such a thing. The week after that, Mrs. Chen left $5 in an envelope at my door. I almost left them on her doorstep because I didn't want her money. But then I realized this wasn't about money. This was about her saying, "You matter. Your gift matters." So I let her pay, and I started taking orders. A loaf of sourdough, a dozen cookies, a birthday cake, small and simple, decorated with the kind of care that comes from someone who still believes in the power of handmade things. I worked out of my tiny apartment kitchen, using my minimal savings to buy flour and butter and eggs. I worked late into the night, after the world had quieted down, when it was just me and the smell of baking, and the rhythm of kneading dough, and the meditative state that comes from knowing exactly what your hands need to do. The baking became a language. I would leave notes with the baked goods, little messages in my shaky handwriting. Miss Dorothy kept every note. She showed them to me one afternoon months into this practice. She had them arranged in a small box organized by date. There were dozens of them, notes that I'd left in passing, not knowing they would be saved, not knowing they would matter this much. "You saved my life," she said simply. "In March, when you first moved in, I was thinking about not being here anymore. And I thought, well, I can't kill myself." I didn't cry. I still didn't cry easily, but something inside me shifted. I realized that my pain and my purpose were intertwined, that the very things that had broken me open were the same things that allowed me to pour something healing into other people's cracks. This went on for about 5 years. I lived in that apartment and I baked and I slowly built a small community of women who understood me without me having to explain anything. We didn't talk much about what we'd lost. We didn't have to. We could see it in each other, the careful way we moved through the world, the way we flinched sometimes at unexpected kindness, the way we never asked for too much because we'd already been told we didn't deserve it. During those years, David's visits were rare. He'd come to the apartment maybe twice a year, bringing cases of wine or expensive chocolates, gifts that felt like apologies for things he couldn't quite articulate. He never stayed long. Victoria never came with him, which was its own kind of statement. He would ask the same question every time. "I'm managing," I would say, but I was doing more than managing. I was slowly, incrementally, becoming someone different, someone smaller, yes. I'd lost weight from the stress of those early years, but also someone clearer about who she was. Someone who understood, finally, that other people's approval was never going to be enough to make her feel like she mattered. The baking orders grew. Someone would tell a friend. The friend would call and ask if I could make a cake for a church function. Could I do bread for a small wedding? Could I make cookies for a holiday party? I was still working out of my apartment kitchen, still using my tiny oven and my ancient mixer. But I was, for the first time in my life, building something that was entirely mine. I was 63 years old, with no prospects, no family, and nothing but a deep knowledge of how to make beautiful things from simple ingredients. It was the beginning of everything. The conversation that changed everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Miss Dorothy came to my apartment with a key and a proposition. She'd been thinking, she said. She had a property, a building that had been sitting empty for years, inherited from an aunt, maintained but unused. It was in a neighborhood that was beginning to gentrify, where young professionals were moving in, where property values were climbing. The taxes on the property were eating into her savings, and she couldn't afford to maintain it properly. But she couldn't sell it either, because selling it would mean losing the one tangible asset she had, the one thing that proved her life had meant something. "You could open a bakery," she said simply. "There's a storefront space. There's a kitchen in the back. You could have a real business." I almost said no immediately. I was too old. I had no business experience. The startup costs would be too much. What if it failed? What if I lost the little money I'd saved? What if... But then I thought about Victoria, about the way she'd said, "You will never be anything but my husband's mother. That's all you've ever been." And I decided that Victoria didn't get to decide what I became. It took 8 months to get the building ready. I applied for a small business loan, an older woman with no business history, which seemed like a formula for rejection. But the loan officer, a woman named Ms. Summers, looked at my application and saw something she wanted to believe in. She asked, "Because women like me, we understand something about what other women need," I said. "We understand about being invisible. I can make bread that tastes like being loved." She approved the loan. The Sweetheart Bakery opened on a Tuesday in October of 1992. I was 63 years old. The space was small, maybe 800 square feet, with a counter at the front and large windows so people could see the baking happening in the open kitchen. I'd painted the walls cream and pale blue. I'd installed a vintage wood-burning stove that I'd found at an antique market, and the smell of it added to the atmosphere. Not just bread and sugar, but something older, something that reminded people of childhood and safety. I'd done everything myself, with help from the women in my building and from David, who'd finally seemed to understand, in some small way, that his mother was building something. He'd helped with the renovation, with the setup. He'd taken a day off work to be there for the opening, though Victoria had declined the invitation. That first morning, I wasn't sure anyone would come. I had made 12 loaves of sourdough, 40 chocolate chip cookies, 2 small cakes, 3 quiches. I had a sign in the window, "Fresh baked days, baked daily." I had made coffee, and I had arranged the chairs at the 3 small tables I'd set up, and I had waited. Mrs. before work, then Miss Dorothy moving slowly with her cane. Ms. Garcia, Miss Roberta, Mrs. Jackson, and their friends' friends. Every loaf was gone. By noon, everything I had made had been sold. I'd made $237.50. I came home that night and cried, really cried, for the first time since moving out of David's house. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that I was capable of creating something people wanted, that my hands, my knowledge, my love translated into something tangible that filled a need. The bakery grew slowly at first, opening. I was working 16-hour days, baking, selling, cleaning, managing. I hired my first employee when I was 65, a young woman named Keisha who was trying to put herself through college. I taught her everything I knew. I paid her more than I could afford because I remembered what it was like to not have enough money, to feel desperate, to believe that the world wasn't going to take care of you. By the time I was 67, the bakery had a line out the door every morning. People would wait 40 minutes for a loaf of my sourdough. I expanded the seating area. I added a small coffee bar. I started taking wedding cake orders. I hired more staff. The Sweetheart Bakery became something bigger than I'd ever imagined. Not just a bakery, but a gathering place. Women would come in and sit for hours, sipping coffee, eating pastries, and slowly becoming part of a community. I knew everyone's names. I knew their stories. I knew that Mrs. Patterson was going through a divorce and needed a safe place to cry over coffee. I knew that Miss Shanice was dealing with the loss of her mother and that my chocolate cake somehow helped. I knew that the Hendricks sisters, who'd been estranged for 5 years, had reconciled over a bread breaking at one of my tables. The bakery mattered. And because I created it, I mattered. When I was 69, a local news station came in to do a feature on successful female entrepreneurs in Tennessee. They wanted to profile women who had built businesses later in life, women who'd defied expectations, women who'd somehow managed to build something meaningful despite the world telling them they were too old, too tired, too damaged. They filmed me in the kitchen early in the morning, my hands working the dough. They talked to my staff who spoke about my generosity, my patience, my belief in them. They talked to customers who spoke about what the bakery meant to them, not just as a place to buy bread, but as a place to feel human, to feel seen. They asked me what I would say to other women who felt like their lives were over, who believed they'd become invisible, who thought they had nothing left to contribute. I would tell them that you don't need anyone's permission to matter, I said, speaking directly to the camera with a steadiness that surprised me. You don't need a man to validate your existence. You don't need your family to approve of your choices. You don't need the world to recognize you. You just need to decide that your life is worth living, and then you get to work. The segment aired on a Thursday evening. It was shared on social media. It went viral in that gentle way things do when they touch something true in people. Hundreds of people saw it, thousands of people eventually, and one of those people was David. He called me the next morning. "Mom," he said, and his voice was different, thick with something I couldn't quite identify. "I saw the thing on TV. Congratulations." I didn't know what to say. I had stopped expecting anything from him. I had reorganized my entire emotional life in the space where David didn't really exist anymore. Not because I hated him, but because holding on to anger at him took energy, and I had decided to use my energy for building instead of holding grudges. "Thank you," I said carefully. He asked, "I want to hear about everything. I want to catch up. I want to understand what I did to you, what I made possible for you." We met at the bakery on Saturday morning. He walked in and looked around like he'd never seen the place before, though he must have driven past it hundreds of times. He must have heard about it from people in the neighborhood. He must have known that his mother had built something without him, something that had nothing to do with him. He ordered coffee and a cinnamon roll, and we sat at one of the 3 small tables that had become sacred spaces for hundreds of women over the years. And he cried. "I've been a terrible son," he said, and it sounded like the words had been sitting on his heart for a long time, waiting for the moment when he could finally speak them. "You made a choice," I said. I wasn't angry anymore, but I wasn't going to pretend that what happened didn't happen. "You chose your wife over your mother. That had consequences." She seemed perfect at first," he said. "And I know what you thought about her. I remember how you looked at her, but I wanted to believe it was going to be okay. I wanted to believe that the right love would smooth out all the rough edges. And by the time I realized, I was in too deep. She had convinced me that you were the problem." He took a drink of his coffee. His hands were shaking slightly. I asked, "Why are you here now?" "Victoria left me," he said quietly. "6 months ago, she had an affair, and when I found out, she just left, took some money, took her things and walked out. And I realized that she'd been using me the entire time. She'd only married me because of Dad's money and my connections, and I let her do it." He paused. "I lost you," he said. "I lost you because I was too weak to see what was happening, and then I watched you become extraordinary without me. I watched you build something beautiful, and I realized that you didn't need me. You never needed me." I sat across from my son in the bakery I'd built from nothing, and I tried to feel something about this revelation. But what I felt was mostly sadness. Sadness for the years we'd lost. Sadness for the person he'd been trying to become. Sadness for the fact that sometimes people learn lessons too late, after they've already done irreversible damage. "Your father was right about you," I said finally. "He always said you were too soft-hearted, that you absorbed other people's emotions instead of setting boundaries, that your need to be liked made you vulnerable to people who could manipulate you. I think he was trying to warn me in his way." David nodded slowly. Is there any way to fix this?" I considered the question for a long time. The truth was, I didn't know if we could go back to something we'd broken, but maybe we could build something new, something based on honesty instead of fantasy, on acceptance instead of expectation. "We can try," I said, "but it's going to take time. And you need to understand that my life now, my bakery, my friends, my independence, that's not something I'm going to sacrifice again. If you're going to be in my life, you're going to have to respect the person I've become. You're going to have to understand that I'm not your mother the way I used to be. I'm Eleanor, just Eleanor." "I can do that," he said. Over the next year, David and I slowly rebuilt something. Not the relationship we'd had before. That was gone, and trying to reconstruct it would have been dishonest, but something different, something built on truth. He started coming to the bakery every Saturday morning. He'd order coffee and a pastry and sit at one of the tables working on his laptop, becoming part of the rhythm of the place. He wasn't trying to take over or improve things. He was just there, being present in a way he hadn't been present for years. Slowly, he began to help me with the business side of things. I'd never been interested in the accounting or the marketing strategy, but David was good at those things. He helped me understand the numbers, helped me see opportunities for growth, helped me think about what would happen to the bakery when I eventually got older and wasn't able to work 16-hour days anymore. More importantly, he seemed to be learning something. He was watching how I ran the bakery, with grace, with generosity, with a deep understanding that this wasn't just a business, it was a ministry. He was watching how I treated my employees, how I created a space where people felt valued, how I managed to be successful without becoming someone I didn't recognize. He brought his daughter to the bakery one day, my granddaughter Sophie, who was 12 years old. She was a beautiful, intelligent girl who looked at me with uncertainty, not sure what her grandmother actually was to her, given how little they'd seen each other over the years. "Your grandmother makes the best bread in Memphis," David told her. I taught Sophie to make bread. I taught her the way my grandmother had taught me, not with instructions, but with presence, with the implicit understanding that some things have to be learned by your hands, by your instincts, by the way your body understands how dough should feel. By the end of the afternoon, Sophie had made a loaf of sourdough that was imperfect and beautiful, and she looked at me like she was beginning to understand who her grandmother was. I was 70 when Victoria reappeared. I was no longer surprised by anything, so when she walked into the bakery on a Tuesday morning, looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with her physical appearance, I simply noted it and waited to see what she wanted. She was in her 60s now, and the years hadn't been kind. She'd aged in the way people age when they've spent their lives taking and not giving, getting and not offering. She was still beautiful. That hadn't changed, but the beauty looked desperate now, like a mask she was working harder and harder to maintain. "Eleanor," she said when she saw me, and her smile was the same smile I remembered, the one that was warm on the surface and cold underneath. "I saw you on the news." I didn't respond. I simply waited. "David mentioned that you might be interested in a business opportunity," she continued. I'm starting a new venture, and I think your recipes and my business acumen could be a powerful combination. I'm thinking about franchising the bakery concept. Multiple locations across Tennessee, maybe further. We could expand to the entire region. You could finally be wealthy, Eleanor. She pulled out a proposal. Professionally done, well thought out, objectively smart. It was a good business idea. If I were a different kind of person, a person who cared about expansion and wealth and building an empire, it might have been exactly what I wanted. But I wasn't that person anymore. No, I said simply, just hear me out. No, I said again. I want the bakery to stay where it is. I want it to serve the people who come to it because they love it. She tried to negotiate. She tried to make it seem like I was being unreasonable. She tried to appeal to my sense of ambition, my desire to be recognized, my fear of missing out on an opportunity. But all of her arguments were based on the idea that I was still the same woman I'd been when I lived in her house, desperate for approval, afraid of being invisible, unsure of my own worth. I wasn't that woman anymore. Goodbye, Victoria, I said, and I turned back to the customer I'd been helping, and I didn't look at her again. She left, and David called me that evening, full of apologies for whatever she'd said, full of shame that she'd approached me at all. I told him that it was fine, that Victoria was Victoria, and that was never going to change, but he'd learned something finally. He'd learned to see clearly, to understand manipulation when he encountered it, to respect the people who wouldn't let themselves be used. Around this time, one of my regular customers, a woman named Mrs. Washington, who came in every Saturday for a loaf of my whole wheat bread, mentioned something that shifted everything again. She was a woman in her early 70s, healthy and financially secure and desperately, achingly lonely. Her daughter had moved to California and rarely called. Her son had cut contact years ago after she'd expressed disapproval of his current girlfriend. She had grandchildren she'd never met. She spent her days reading, watching television, and coming to the bakery, where at least she could sit and be around other people. I have good pensions, she told me one day, almost ashamed. I have money. I have savings, but I'm so lonely it makes it hard to eat. I looked at her and I saw myself. I saw Miss Dorothy, Miss Roberta, Miss Garcia, all the women who had been pushed to the margins of their families' lives because they'd become inconvenient, invisible, burdensome. What if there was a place for them? A place designed specifically for women who had been abandoned, where loneliness wasn't a personal failure, but a shared condition, where we could build community with each other. I started researching. I looked into what it would take to open an assisted living facility. I studied the regulations, the financial requirements, the oversight needed. It was going to take significant resources, more than I had accumulated so far, but I also had something more valuable. I had the understanding that this needed to exist. I had the knowledge of what women like us needed. It took me 2 years to save enough money and put together the proposal. During those 2 years, I worked with David on the business plan. I found an investor, a woman named Patricia, who had also been abandoned by her family and who wanted to do something meaningful with her wealth. Together, we began to form the vision for what we called the Haven. The Haven would be an elderly home, but not like the ones that existed. Not sterile, not institutional, not designed to make you feel like you were being warehoused until you died. It would be a home for women specifically. Women whose families had discarded them, women who had no one, women who had been invisible for so long they'd almost forgotten they were supposed to exist. The residents would maintain their independence but have the security of community. We would have medical staff available, recreational activities, communal meals. But mostly, we would have each other. We would have a place where being abandoned didn't erase you, where age didn't diminish your value, where the people around you cared whether you existed because they understood, in their bones, what it meant to not matter to anyone else. The Haven opened on a morning in late spring when the magnolias were blooming. Memphis smelled like flowers and green things coming back to life. It felt like the right time for a resurrection. We had 15 residents the first day. Miss Dorothy came, though her health was declining and she needed more help than she used to. Mrs. Chen, who'd been secretly learning English through a language app on her phone and wanted to tell her grandchildren her stories, even if they didn't want to listen. Mrs. Washington, who came with relief so profound it was visible on her face. Mrs. Jackson, who'd been living alone in a studio apartment and spending most of her time in the library because it was free, and at least there were people there. And 13 other women I'd met through the bakery, women who'd been recommended by social workers and counselors who understood that the Haven was something different, something revolutionary in its simplicity, a place that was home. I'd reduced my hours at the bakery to 3 days a week, enough to keep it running, to maintain the traditions that people loved, to make sure that no one who came looking for comfort would find it gone. The other days, I spent at the Haven, watching these women slowly, carefully begin to believe that they mattered. The first week was tender. Some residents were hesitant, defensive, unsure if this was real or if it was some kind of setup, some way they were going to be hurt again. Some of them had been alone so long they didn't remember how to talk to other people, how to take up space in a room, how to ask for what they needed. But slowly, sitting in the common areas, eating meals together, watching the way the staff treated them with genuine respect and care, something began to shift. The women started to smile. They started to remember stories. They started to realize that this place was real, that no one was going to tell them they were a burden, that their existence actually mattered here. Mrs. Chen taught cooking classes using recipes from her childhood, the food she'd made for her husband, the food her daughter had refused to eat. She taught other residents how to make hand-pulled noodles, and as she taught them, she was also teaching them about her history, her value, the fact that she'd been alive and had mattered once. Mrs. Washington started a book club. She led discussions about what she'd read, and gradually she became the kind of leader she'd always wanted to be. Someone whose thoughts mattered, whose interpretations were valued, someone who could influence the direction of a conversation and have it mean something. Miss Dorothy, though her health continued to decline, became the unofficial grandmother of the Haven. She listened to people's stories. She remembered details, the names of grandchildren who'd never called, the dreams people had once had, the small moments that made life worth living. She made people feel seen in a way that most people never experience, and in doing so, she was finally getting to live the version of her life where she was essential. The Haven became known throughout Memphis. Social workers started referring women to us. News outlets came back, asking about this unusual assisted living facility, the one run by an older woman entrepreneur who seemed to understand something essential about what abandoned women needed. How did I know? They asked. Because I was one of them, I said simply, and I learned that being invisible is a choice. I'm now 71 years old. Miss Dorothy passed away last year, peacefully, in her sleep, surrounded by the family she'd built here, not the one that abandoned her, but the one that had chosen her and loved her back. Mrs. Washington is teaching a new cooking class this week. Mrs. Chen has become an artist. She paints in the common room, and her pictures of Shanghai as she remembers it, pictures of her childhood, pictures of her husband, hang on the walls of the Haven. They're beautiful. They're proof that she existed, that her memories matter, that the world is richer for having her in it. I still go to the bakery 3 days a week. I wake up early, mix flour and sugar and eggs, watch the ovens fill with warmth. The smell of cinnamon and vanilla fills the small space. People line up before opening because the Sweetheart Bakery is more than just a bakery now. It's a landmark, a place where people come not just to buy bread, but to be part of something that tastes like love. The other 4 days, I'm at the Haven. I walk the halls and check in with residents. I sit with people who are struggling with the weight of invisibility that they've carried for decades. I help them understand that the Haven is proof they don't have to carry it anymore. David comes every week. He brings Sophie, who's learning to make bread from me, who's learning what it looks like to be a woman who doesn't need anyone's permission to matter. He brings his new partner, a woman he met through friends, a woman who understands that he comes with a mother who's built an empire and who respects that rather than resenting it. We've repaired what we could repair. We haven't erased what happened, but we've learned to live with it, to understand that people make choices that hurt the people they love, and sometimes they learn from those choices, and sometimes they don't. David learned. He became someone worthy of redemption, which is all any of us can hope for. The Sweetheart Bakery is famous now. People travel from across the region to eat my bread. The Haven is becoming a model that's being replicated in other cities. Women building sanctuaries for other women, creating spaces where being abandoned doesn't erase you, where age and invisibility aren't death sentences. I've been offered book deals, consulting gigs, speaking engagements. I've been told that my story is inspiring, that I'm an example of resilience, that I've overcome adversity and built something beautiful. But what they don't understand is that the adversity wasn't the point. The building was the point. The moment when I stopped waiting for permission and started making bread was the point. The second when I decided that Victoria didn't get to decide what I became. That was the moment everything changed. I still remember being invisible. I still remember sitting in David's house, organizing my existence around making myself small. I still remember the apartment, the early mornings, the darkness of believing that my life was over because the life I'd planned for, wife, mother, the support system for everyone else, had collapsed. But I also remember the first day of the bakery when I made $237.50, and I cried because I mattered. I remember teaching Sophie to make bread, watching her understand that she had the power to create something beautiful with her own hands. I remember sitting at the bakery table with David and watching him finally understand what he'd lost, what he'd made possible for me by pushing me away. And I remember the haven, the most important thing I've built. I remember watching women who'd been told they were worthless slowly begin to believe that they were valuable. I remember Miss Dorothy, who would have taken her own life if I hadn't left bread on her doorstep decades ago, becoming someone's grandmother, someone's friend, someone's light in the darkness. This is Eleanor Hayes. I'm 71 years old, and I want to tell you something. If you are a woman who has been thrown away by the people who were supposed to love you, if you've spent decades making yourself invisible, if you've lost your family, if you believe your life is over, you need to know something. Your value doesn't come from them. You don't need their validation. You don't need their permission to matter. You just need to decide that your life is worth living, and then you get to work. You might bake, you might build, you might write or teach or create, or simply sit with another abandoned woman and remind her that she exists. But whatever you do, do it for yourself. Do it because you matter. Do it because the world tried to make you disappear, and you decided not to cooperate with that plan. Comment below and tell me where you're listening to this. Tell me if you're in an apartment like the one I lived in, or in a home where you don't feel welcome, or in a place of success and wondering what comes next. Tell me if you've ever felt abandoned, if you've ever had to rebuild. Tell me where you're from, and let's build a community where we believe that women like us don't need to be rescued by princes. We can rescue ourselves. We can build our own kingdoms. We can make bread that tastes like being loved, and we can feed it to each other. And we can become the family we were always supposed to have. This is my truth, and now it's yours too.